Hi, this is Anthony, and welcome back to my show. And Happy New Year. It's now 2023. It's been nearly 12 hours since my last comment and Q&A video, and I've gotten a lot of questions and comments. And also, I've gone back and seen that I have many unanswered questions and comments. I thought that I would answer some more. For some reason, it seems that not all my comments that I get a copy sent to my email, although some do. And it appears that if somebody leaves a comment or question to somebody else's comment, then I don't necessarily get an email about that. And because I have over 185 videos that I've done over the past year or so, it's certainly possible that people's comments can get missed by me. And please remember that while I'm trying to build this into a monetized channel, currently I don't get a single penny for all the work that I put into these. Even though they are very basic compared to other people's videos, they do take a number of hours to do, even the simplest of videos. And even if this channel was monetized, I've estimated, and this seems to be confirmed from other sources, that I would be making about $1 a day at this point. So if it takes a while to respond to your messages, I apologize. And if you've ever looked at messages left on literally any other YouTube channel, no matter what the content is, a lot of messages are like the ones that I'm showing here. Okay, here's a message that's clearer to understand, and the original message from this commenter from a week ago. Do you know what year the FBI admitted losing or destroying the 8 cigarette butts and any specific information they disclosed regarding why the butts were not properly secured? Reason I ask is because typically chain of custody is required for evidentiary credibility, so evidence in storage must be approved and signed off before removal. I'm not suggesting a botched custody per se, but rather due to an open case is the FBI potentially withholding the cigarette evidence until DNA identifies the perpetrator. This premise seems plausible if the purported loss of cigarettes was reported after DNA testing evolved, but unlikely if the evidence was reported missing before DNA testing began in 1984. When I was researching answers for this question, there was a little bit of information on the Citizen Sleuth site, as well as from online magazines that talk about this. It sounds like Special Agent Carr sent all the evidence that he had to Quantico to be tested, and that it was returned to him in Seattle. It was not super clear if the cigarettes had been in the Seattle field office and sent to Quantico, but it seems that they did not end up being returned to the Seattle field office and may have been returned to the Reno FBI field office, whereby they seem to have been lost. It's not clear if it's been definitively acknowledged that the cigarette butts were destroyed, or if that's just an assumption, or if they really are just currently lost, sitting on a shelf in Quantico or perhaps Reno, which is of course the FBI field office that took possession of them when the plane that Cooper had hijacked landed in Reno. It could be that they were put in an evidence bag and returned, and there was a mistake made on labeling, and it's just waiting to be found by somebody taking the time to look through the probably thousands of bags of evidence. Unless somebody can find an FBI document that says we have determined that there is no longer any evidentiary use to hold on to this evidence, so it has been destroyed on this date, at this time, at this location, then I think that we can hold out some hope at some point the cigarette butts could be located, which would likely then solve the case through DNA. In doing my research, it was pointed out that Cooper smoked a certain type of Raleigh cigarettes, which are inexpensive cigarettes that people could use coupons to get. Evidently, 2 FBI agents visited the Raleigh headquarters and searched through their records of customers and actually found 2 people named Dan Cooper, but they were contacted and excluded as suspects. So, as much as we want to fault the FBI in dropping the ball when you look at a lot of the evidence, it does seem that they did pursue a lot of leads that obviously went nowhere. I think it's pretty clear from what the FBI has admitted and what Tom Carr has said, is that at the very least the cigarette butts seem to be misplaced. I don't think it's a case where they have them and they've done DNA testing, which has led to an identified candidate and they're waiting to pounce on him. Now, I could be wrong on that, but it seems like if they had identified a living suspect, they would have taken action by now. We have to remember that the age range of Cooper was considered to be, say, 45 to 50. The incident happened 51 years ago. If Cooper survived the jump and was still alive, he would likely be between roughly 95 and 100 years old now. The odds are, even if he did survive, he would have died by now, and if he was still alive, then the FBI should make their move. I doubt that he is much of a flight risk or a danger as far as being a violent felon now. My second question concerns the North Carolina parachute. If this was potentially used by Cooper, it makes sense the FBI would have seized the gear, tested for pollen and other organics associated with the Pacific Northwest foliage or aquatic vegetation. Do you know if the FBI had already eliminated McCoy as a suspect and therefore had concluded testing his gear was irrelevant? This is an excellent question. As far as excluding McCoy as a suspect, the FBI basically has done that by not prosecuting him for the Cooper skyjacking of 1971 when they caught McCoy and prosecuted him for the 1972 skyjacking. If they thought that the evidence was strong, they would have added those charges to the slam dunk 1972 incident. Obviously, the researcher of the Real McCoy book was an FBI agent, and he believed that McCoy was Cooper. In the book, evidently, he claims that the FBI agent who shot and killed McCoy stated that he thought McCoy was Cooper. However, if you watch Dan Gryder's second documentary, where he talks to the FBI agent who killed McCoy, it's pretty clear to me that he is indicating that he was misquoted in the book. So basically, you have one FBI agent who publicly thinks that McCoy was Cooper, and all the rest who don't buy into that. Reading a little bit from Citizen Sleuth about the analysis of the tie, originally only about 1 inch square area of the tie was studied using sticky tape, and then later on they may have put it in a vacuum which sucked out the particles. And again, depending on what sources you read, things seem to contradict each other or not be in perfect alignment with other details or explanations. It would be interesting to see if there was any pollen from this area, that be the Pacific Northwest where I live, or some other area in the United States that could be found on the tie. I know that the lab analysis for the tie is available online, and there are people who are far more knowledgeable about it than I, who might be able to answer specifics about plant pollen on the tie. As far as the parachute supposedly found in Richard Floyd McCoy's mother's barn by Dan Gryder, honestly, I'm very skeptical about that being Cooper's parachute. Again, I freely admit that when I first saw Dan Gryder's first video, subtitled Family Secrets, I was convinced that McCoy had also done the Cooper skyjacking. But other viewers pointed out a lot of problems, and looking at them, I'm convinced that McCoy was not Cooper. I've talked about those reasons in many of my videos, and specifically made one about the specific reasons why McCoy was not Cooper. I think everything about the Cooper-McCoy theory falls apart if you really think about it. The only similarities between the two cases are that similar planes were skyjacked and the perpetrator departed using the aft staircase. The personality and demeanor of the two skyjackers was completely different. The weapons used were completely different. The interaction that the skyjackers had with the crew and passengers was completely different. McCoy was said to be a devout Mormon who did not smoke or drink. Cooper smoked at least 8 cigarettes and had 2 bourbons. He was described as having dark skin and no discernible accent. McCoy had lighter skin and a southern accent. But let us say for a moment that McCoy carried out the Cooper skyjacking of Flight 305 in 1971. Now we know that of the $200,000 ransom, he definitely did not keep at least $6,000 of it, as about $5,800 of it was found about 9 years later in the sand on the north shore of the Columbia River. Now, some people come up with fairly fantastical theories that maybe he planted 3 bundles of money there to throw off searchers. Now, it's one thing if the skyjacker would have taken a few packets of the money, slipped off the rubber bands, and tossed handfuls of cash out the back of the airplane before he jumped to try to throw off searchers, especially if he threw it out a number of minutes before he actually jumped, which would throw the searchers off far to the north of where he actually landed. But in fact, this money was found by an 8-year-old boy about 9 years later, so not a very good place to plant the money if you're hoping to throw off searchers in the days after the skyjacking. Plus, while the information seems to be a bit contradictory, it does seem that most of the money was found about 3 inches below the sand, although there might have been what have been described as shards, that is, decomposing fragments, of money buried deeper. But this area seems to have had sand dumped on it from dredging operations in 1974. I believe, and many people do, including the FBI, that the money, and probably Cooper, whom it was tied to in a bag, ended up in the Columbia, and that the money that was found was dredged up from the Columbia, which is typical to keep it deep enough for ships to travel up and down, and then the dredging sand was deposited on the shoreline. Now, McCoy's supporters will argue that either he purposefully buried the money in the sand, or else he dropped those particular 3 bundles accidentally and they all showed up at the same place, but that he kept the rest of the money. Or maybe he lost all of the money. But if McCoy was Cooper, and he survived, would the bulk of the money survive with him? Well, then what happened to the money? Because less than half a year later, he commits the actual hijacking that he eventually was caught for and prosecuted and found guilty for. A skyjacking that nobody disputes. And it's agreed upon that the reason that he had to commit the skyjacking in 1972 was that the family was in desperate need of money. And there's no indication that in less than 5.5 months he had spent nearly $200,000 on stuff. So, that would indicate that he did not maintain control of the money from the Cooper skyjacking. But if you were McCoy and you jumped out of an airplane somewhere over southwest Washington or northern Oregon, and you had lost all that money, why in the world are you going to bother to keep the harness and parachute that you used? There's absolutely no reason to, and in fact every reason to get rid of it. You don't need it as a souvenir. And if you kept it, then the odds are pretty good that it might be found by law enforcement at some point, especially if you commit another crime less than half a year later. So keeping it not only makes no sense at all, but then explain how it gets from Provo, Utah to North Carolina to be in his mother's barn. No one can adequately explain that. After the second skyjacking, the one known to have been committed by McCoy, the FBI searched his place and of course found lots of evidence, including the ransom money from the second skyjacking. How did they miss the Cooper chute and harness? I doubt that they would. And even if they did, again, how did it get to North Carolina? He was apprehended in Utah and then ended up in prison. He never had the time to go to North Carolina and hide the chute in his mother's barn. Now, there was more than one chute found in North Carolina, if you watch Dan Gryder's video. Some of the stuff belonged to another member of the family that they didn't even know who it was, but it had the same last name. Richard Floyd McCoy was a skydiver. It wouldn't be out of the ordinary for him to have parachutes. Maybe he even kept some military chutes that he had been issued. I don't dispute the likelihood that some of the chutes shown in Dan Gryder's video could well have belonged to Richard Floyd McCoy, but I don't see any evidence that proves that it or the modified harness belonged to the original skyjacker attributed to Cooper. Anytime somebody says this is the only modified harness, or this is the only this, or the only that, you can better believe that there are probably thousands or millions of them out there like that. I cannot believe that in the entire history of skydiving, there's only been one harness where the ripcord has been moved from one side to the other. And Dan Gryder has personally responded to what I've said about this, and he obviously disagrees with me, but provides no clear evidence on that. But let's think about this logically. If in fact this harness and parachute were from the skyjacking of Flight 305 by Dan Cooper, these would be the most significant pieces of evidence found since some of the money was found in 1980. This would be the Holy Grail. So where's that evidence now? Still in the barn? Now, I've said before that I don't think that I'm going to be the one who cracks the Dan Cooper case. I'm not even striving for that. I find the case interesting, as do thousands of people, and I find it interesting to talk about the clues and see if they're really clues or if there's some misinformation intentionally or unintentionally behind them. But I'm not trying to prove a particular candidate or a particular theory here, because as I've stated, I think that probably Cooper died in the Columbia River and therefore is not any of the known candidates, since all of them survived past 1971. Do I have an unknown suspect that I think is a good candidate? No, not at all. Do I think that I will find that person? Very unlikely. Do I think that in the Cooper sphere of people searching for answers, will somebody potentially come up with a candidate based on circumstantial evidence that disappeared in late 1971? I think that's a possibility. But all of that being said, if I was a researcher and I found a parachute and harness that I had no doubt belonged to the person called D.B. Cooper, that I would be taking that to the FBI and to every news organization and letting everyone in the world know about it and not stop talking about it until it was either excluded or conclusively solved this mystery. But in the case of this mysterious parachute, other than in a video from a guy that plays fast and loose with facts and interpretations, there is very little out there about this find. That should tell you something. I think that it's likely that the finder of these items realized, nope, this is not the smoking gun that we were hoping to find. And that's assuming that it's not just a completely fake story. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt here. I don't accuse people of lying unless I see clear evidence of it, and I don't see that here. So lastly, I'm just going to say that we have 3 potential known pieces of evidence. The money found in 1980 at a place called Tina Bar, the tie that was left behind, which is believed to have belonged to the skyjacker, and which may or may not contain DNA and other particles that may lead to particular suspects or may exclude some particular suspects. And then possibly this parachute. But while we know where the money and the tie is, we don't know where the parachute is. And of course, this is not the only parachute which people have found that they believe may have belonged to the skyjacker. Okay, let's move on. Last question regarding the theory Cooper perished upon landing, which sounds most plausible in my opinion. Although research would be extremely time-consuming, are you aware whether the FBI cross-checked missing person reports and unexplained absence of future tax returns? For example, even if Cooper was not reported missing, the possibility he died could be substantiated by the absence of future returns, assuming he was previously employed and regularly filed prior to 1972. Typically, the deceased are issued a death certificate which retires their Social Security number, but in Cooper's scenario, no death certificate was issued, so the Social Security number would remain active while the tax filing and paper trail would cease if he died, seemingly a potential clue for investigators on the case. Once again, some very good observations and questions here. I do not know specifically of what type of cross-checking the FBI did at any point in time with people that dropped off the radar in 1971 or who stopped filing taxes in that year or other things associated with Social Security numbers. I'm in no way an expert on any of that type of research, but my understanding is that because of the nature of the government that we have in the United States and the division of responsibility between the federal government and states, and between states and counties and cities, that there are jurisdictional considerations, legal considerations on what type of crimes different levels of law enforcement are charged with investigating, etc. And because of those reasons, we've all heard of cases where people commit crimes in one area and local law enforcement are just not equipped to investigate it. But it doesn't rise to the level of a federal crime, so the FBI doesn't get involved. And so the person slips through the cracks for a long time. And again, I'm not an expert in it, but it seems like there have been registers of sex offenders that eventually were created because there were no registers previously or no national databases that could be scanned when investigating those types of crimes. And that also includes missing persons, especially back then. And sometimes there are quirks in the law that don't allow certain things to happen. I don't know if there's anything that would prevent the FBI from going to the Social Security Administration and having them run a check on males of a certain age who stopped contributing to Social Security after Thanksgiving in 1971. Certainly that might identify some potential candidates. Now, even if they did that, would that necessarily catch Cooper? Not necessarily. I think that if it could be done, it might very well identify some good suspects, assuming that Cooper really did perish when he departed the plane, which it sounds like you are open to, and I am of the mind that he probably did perish at that time, although I don't rule out that he might have survived. But a couple things to keep in mind along these lines. Cooper was said to have not had a distinguishable accent, and that he did not have a Southern accent like McCoy had, but something that to somebody working on an airline flying between Oregon and Washington would not notice. And remember, Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant, spent about 4.5 hours with Cooper, sitting next to him, is going to be our best witness, although we all know that witnesses can make mistakes, but she didn't seem to detect an accent. And I'm sure that everyone who came into contact with Cooper on that day was interviewed by the FBI or law enforcement, and I assume that none of them detected an accent. But it was pointed out that he had darker skin than what we assume from the black and white versions of the sketch artist renderings of Cooper. He is said to have had Mexican or Indian blood, or perhaps have been of Italian ancestry. This evidently comes from Tina Mucklow and can be found in online FBI records. So based on appearance, and a number of people have speculated that Cooper might have been Native American, perhaps raised on a reservation, possibly from the Pacific Northwest. Certainly there are many reservations in Washington state and some in Oregon. I think that many people believe that Cooper had been in the military and probably gained some parachuting experience from that. He was believed to have been in his mid-40s, possibly up to 50. Is it possible that a Native American youth joined the military in his late teens, perhaps was in for 20 years, retired from the service, and moved back to a reservation? Perhaps he was getting retirement from the military, and perhaps he was also on disability, but not something that would completely prevent him from potentially working at something. Maybe doing odd jobs that didn't result in Social Security taxes being taken out. Could he have fallen off the radar of the IRS legitimately or semi-legitimately prior to 1971 based on low reported military benefits and unreported additional income? I'm not sure, but I don't think that it's a stretch of the imagination to believe that somebody in that situation might not be paying into Social Security immediately up to 1971 and then disappearing from the radar after that. So that's a possibility. And to further support the Native American theory, Cooper told a flight attendant that he had a grudge, but not a grudge against her airline. Certainly it's not a stretch of the imagination that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, some Native Americans may have had a grudge against the federal government or other entities. There's also speculation that the person might have been from Canada, in particular perhaps British Columbia. In that case, they probably would not show up, at least consistently, in a Social Security database in the United States. I think that if Cooper was a Canadian, as long as he didn't use the word progress and conscientiously remembered not to end sentences with a, then he may not have had a detectable accent to the ears of a flight attendant from the Pacific Northwest. Okay, some good comments and questions here. Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up now. As always, I really do appreciate everyone hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. It doesn't cost you anything, and it literally takes a second. If you like my videos, I would love it if you hit the like button, and please do comment in the comment section if you have something relevant to say, or if you can answer an issue that I haven't been able to. Thanks again for viewing, and Happy New Year.